Welcome, sir. Today I'm having a conversation with Mr. Ashok, and he is going to share his transplant story. He has been a donor, and we are going to talk about his experience today. So, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good, Soha. Thank you. And yeah, I was quite excited to hear about this initiative that you and Aman have been involved with. So good. I'm glad.
Same, sir. We are very glad, and I am also super excited to talk about it. So, sir, I'll just jump right into it. Tell me, what was your initial thought process when you got to know that someone in your close circle, in your family, needed an organ transplant, and you could be the one who could, help them out?
I yeah. So just to go back a little bit, my youngest brother had renal failure in December of 1999.
Okay.
And so that was just before the millennium sort of kicked in, and he had returned from the Gulf, and 2 days before the new year, he was pretty ill, and I took him to a doctor friend who had one look at his reports and just generally said that it just didn't look very good at all. And he sent us to a specialist that same evening who was attached to Jahangir Hospital. And that person had a look at the reports and essentially said, just get admitted immediately right away. So it was a matter of hours from consulting with the doctors. And but 2000, if you take 2000 as the timeline, because it's happened literally 2 days before the new year, is when we basically discovered that this was an issue. And we have 5 siblings altogether, the family. So I have 1 sister and 3 other brothers. And one of the brothers was on a ship that he was serving on. So in terms of his availability for discussions for this whole business of whether or not a kidney transplant within the family was a possibility, and testing and how the testing needed to be done and all of these things, he could not be included in that conversation. My sister was in Australia and she could not be included in that particular conversation. And the other thing is that the Australian government typically does not encourage women to get into live organ donation. So that was one of the issues. And my brother was actually right in the middle of immigrating to Australia at the same time.
Okay.
So what had happened was that, of course, the initial stages that typically happen, this is that you're admitted and then you're on dialysis, and then the doctors are basically getting you ready for some sort of conversation saying that if it is chronic renal failure, then chronic renal failure essentially means that you either are on a lifetime of dialysis, but the preferred option at all times is obviously a transplant. And that the first option for a transplant always is with a family member. And the second option that is available, obviously, was cadaver transplants.
Correct.
Yeah. And so the discussion largely, or the decision in this particular area largely fell to me being here. And my brother, who was migrating to Australia, who, of course, in that transition mode was a very complicated business, in addition to the fact that he was also married, and I wasn't.
Okay.
And yeah, so, of course, I think that we sort of very early on in the process, I think in towards the end of January, middle end of January, we at least came to an understanding that a transplant was essential, that both my brother who was going to Australia and I were comfortable with the idea. to the point that we had decided to start doing the various tests that were required for the process. And so we did some of the work here in Pune. Some of the testing was not available here, so we had to go to Bombay to Harkishan Das.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, again, I think very early in the process, when the preliminary tests were done here in Pune, and we had a conversation with one of the doctors in Ruby Hall. The doctor in Ruby Hall essentially, very bluntly said that, listen, if one of you is unmarried and one of you is married, then I would suggest that the person who's unmarried is perhaps a better choice, simply because he does not have to consult too many people. Whereas a married person will have the issues with the wife and the in-laws, and it becomes what happens as a consequence of that is that one loses valuable time. Apart from the fact that, like I said, he needed to get into Australia by a certain time to stamp his passport with the wife and the family and the kids. He had 2 sons, and so that all became part of the discussion. And both of us were agreeable to the process. I was very comfortable, like I told you when we had our earlier discussion, because I also happened to have been very lucky to spend a lot of time with a very close friend who had been a kidney donor about 10 or 12 years earlier. Okay. So we are talking about sometime in the late 80s. And I think more to the point, it is a lot simpler for somebody to absorb information in a purely academic framework where you're not being put under pressure to say, I want your kidney, therefore I'm giving you this information for you to process.
Yeah.
Rather than you have it, the way you understand diabetes in an academic sense or heart disease in an academic sense, and that you need to be sensitive about lifestyles now, rather than to be on the doorstep of a crisis and then having to deal with all sorts of issues. And I think that ideally that is the perfect situation for a person to be faced with, that you know somebody who's done it, you know that that person has a perfectly normal and healthy lifestyle, and that that itself gives you a great deal of confidence and comfort in the process, even if you don't understand the medical jargon and technicalities, which to me really is not particularly helpful and useful, simply because 1 week or 2 months of talking about it doesn't make you a specialist.
Correct.
And and I think it's useful to talk to more than one doctor, but talking to too many of them is not also a very good idea, personally. You need to be very selective about whom you're having a discussion with. You need to have perhaps your family doctor on board. He will guide you to a specialist. You take the views of maybe 2, a maximum of 3. I would not really even go that far. And ultimately, in the end, the decision is yours to make, So then you deal, and I think that different people are, made up differently and hardwired differently, and some people are a little bit more fearful than others. And and so, like I said, for me, the decision was very easy.
Okay.
For me, the decision was very easy. The process that the government has in place is a little bit of a lengthy process and procedure. At least back then it was. I don't know whether they've simplified it now. And also, maybe now you don't have to go to Bombay. Perhaps I don't know whether you still go to Bombay for certain types of tests, but we needed to go to Bombay. And then you need to get permission from government panel doctors and things like that, which probably you still need to do today as well.
Mm.
But that was largely it. And so from January to May, when the operation happened, I think it happened maybe around the 6th of May, 5th or 6th of May. Most people think that was pretty quick. I don't know. I know another very close friend who had renal failure, one of the earliest cases in Pune, a boy called Jeffrey Young, and who eventually died of the problem because he could not get a transplant. And there were all sorts of issues surrounding getting a donor and all sorts of things. And finally, when they got a cadaver transplant, he died, unfortunately, of septicemia, just as a consequence of the surgery. So that was terrible. But yeah, that's how life is, I guess.
Yeah. So, sir, in all this, how was your family's reaction? You know,
I mean,
what part did they play?
the family's reaction is limited, I think, to what they can and can't do. And so that the conversations are around two issues really. One is, where does the kidney come from? And the second is, where does the money come from?
Correct.
You know, these are really two of the most fundamental questions. And then the peripheral questions are always that you're grasping at straws, trying to find out whether there's anything short of a transplant that can miraculously reverse the process. And I think that there is a lot of time that sometimes gets absorbed in that type of discussion. And, I think that there's chronic renal failure, and there is, what is the other one? There is, so chronic renal failure basically is an irreversible process. And there is acute renal failure, which basically is caused by some sort of an infection that suddenly disrupts the functioning of your kidney, and that can be reversed with medication and treatment.
Right. Okay.
So, so chronic renal failure essentially is irreversible. The other question that a lot of people tend to ask when they're faced with something like this is, oh my God, is it both the kidneys? The first question, is it only one? Because if it's one, you don't even know very often that you have a problem, because you've got an overcapacity in a single kidney that you would not even know that you have a problem quite often. At least that's the impression that I have. Which is why, in a way, doctors and the medical community is happy to encourage live donors, simply because the belief is that you can survive more than comfortably on a single kidney. And I think that also at the time that we dealt with this particular situation, transplants was a fairly new thing in Pune. It hadn't been done for very long. Because that was the case, and hospitals were actually quite desperate to get patients so that they could get experience of doing transplants. You actually had hospitals, Jahangir Hospital, for example, had set up a brand new renal unit. And they had barely done any transplants at the time. So they were actually actively saying, we'll give you a discount and we can do it for so much less, and all sorts of things to basically incentivize people to come to the hospital to do the process, so that their doctors and staff would also get a certain amount of experience in doing this. And we chose KEM for two reasons. One is that it was very close to where we stay, so that the convenience and logistics of managing, the up and down for the family and things like that was simple. The other thing is that Dr. Farooq Wadia also happened to be the senior most person in this particular field, and he had been dealing with renal related issues for a very, very long time. I think he was one of the first people in the country who had actually got into renal care and set up the department at the KEM hospital. So that, I think, gave us a certain degree of confidence. And of course, I think that it's fairly well known that the specialists in any case who do the procedures really go to all the hospitals. So it didn't really matter which hospital you did it, because the same hospital was doing the same doctor was doing the procedures typically in KEM, and the same doctor was going to Jahangir and Ruby Hall, at least at that time. Now if you have more specialists in the field, perhaps they are attached to a particular hospital, but I think that specialists still tend to be on call with other hospitals as well.
Right.
So, yeah. And so that was largely it. You had your kidney in place and you had your money in place and you were good to go.
Right, sir. The reason I asked you about your family was because you were aware about the whole process, since like you said, your friend went through it way before than you had to go through in the process, right? So family may not be aware or may not be sure how strongly this process could work, as in how strongly one can survive on one kidney. psychologically it's sometimes hard to actually believe that it can actually work. So if one knows in advance, like you did, it's easier to go through that process. So what do you
That's
think?
right. Yes.
If your family or you could be, were well aware, it could have helped the process in a smoother way?
Look, I think that this situation in terms of, so the recipient will take a kidney from wherever he gets it as a general understanding, because I mean, it's a life and death kind of situation for the recipient. Whether he gets it from a family member or from a cadaver transplant or buying it, on the open market, like sometimes happens or often happens. The recipient's role in this is very nominal, I think. Yeah. That the larger issue is that if you have a donor, then all of the other things can somehow or the other be managed. If you have to borrow money from whoever you have to borrow money, that the most important thing is in place, and the other things fall in place somehow or the other. And like I said, the family had a limited role to play, and the role of the family was simply, there as a support system. But the decisions had to be made by, like I said, they were very direct. In a way, it's a little bit of an uncomplicated decision, unless you don't have somebody who's ready to do it. In our case, it was a simple kind of decision. But now, in the case of this boy that I told you about, this friend of mine who died, he was one of the earliest renal cases in Pune, and it's, I think, fairly well documented in the community. So if you ask people about a boy called Jeffrey Young, you will hear very interesting history and stories about his journey, which was very long and very terrible. He was a fantastic young chap who was a very good musician and played in a band and worked with, in a company belonging to friends of mine. And when they were looking for a donor, and they were finding it hard to get someone, the group of friends around him got hold of his brother and tried to pressurize him into giving his kidney.
Oh.
And he got so frightened and terrified that he ran away from Pune.
What?
The brother ran away from Pune, and he ran away to Bangalore, I think, and he disappeared almost for a year. And in the meantime, a group of people and well-wishers and things like that had collected the money for the process, and then the money was there and the donor wasn't there. And I mean, so that didn't work out for a very, very long time. And then finally, in the end, I think they did, more than 12 years after, 10, 12 years after he had been diagnosed with renal failure, that they did a cadaver transplant at Jahangir. And the surgery went very well, interestingly enough. But he passed away maybe, I think, literally less than a week after the surgery. And it was very, very, very sad. And I wasn't in Pune, I was in Bangalore when he passed away. I visited him in the hospital immediately after the surgery. And he looked in such good shape compared to before. And then I was in Bangalore, and the next thing I heard was that he died of septicemia. Something obviously went terribly wrong, but so that's how it is sometimes.
Yeah. So is there any message you would like to give to people who are scared to go through this process? Because you went through this process long time ago in your life, and you look perfectly fine and healthy to me. And there are people out there who are fearful. So if there's something you would want to say to them.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being fearful, first. It's a most human and most natural kind of reaction. I think that I give far more credit to people who are fearful and still do it than people like me who didn't think too much about it because we had certain sort of this thing, and then the decisions were very simple in that sense. So there's far less credit to somebody who simply says, yeah, I have all the information, it's not a problem. For people who don't have the information and then have to process it from a position of complete unknown, who feel pressured into doing it because, there's a certain amount of emotional, I hate to use the word blackmail, but, there's a whole lot of this emotional kind of pressure that you feel that you're the same blood group, you're the brother or the sister or the mother or the father or whatever the case may be. That's a far more difficult thing. And so I think that what helps is to actually talk to people who've done it. And I've always, like I said, from back in the day, I had then told, and the KM people used to occasionally call me to talk to people on the odd occasion, but now they have a fairly well-organized setup that they have counselors and all sorts of things that are involved in the process. So it does. But I think that there is nothing more reassuring than talking to people who've actually done it. I think, and I could be, because just like I interacted with this friend of mine who had done it, is very different from talking to a doctor or a counselor whose business profession it is to be doing these procedures.
Somebody who's already
they may give you, doctors and counselors will give you medical advice, but giving you the sort of reassurance at a personal level can only come from people with my type of experience, I think, and that need to have that interaction. Some people may not need it, and a lot of people, you might have people like me who are quite okay with it, and you might have people who need to have that level of reassurance. That I think that it is always useful to have a networking of people who are happy to speak to this particular issue, and I'm happy to do it anytime. So if ever you feel that is necessary. But I think that there's so much more that the process can, because what we are at is actually at the end of a particular process. But issues of legislation, the government certainly at our time had very stringent regulations in place. The need to protect people who unwittingly get pulled into something like this for reasons of financial insecurity. The people are selling kidneys or through other means. That there are a number of things that I think that can be done to encourage live kidney, even cadaver transplants. There are a number of countries that make it mandatory. If for example, if you have a driving license, or even if you don't, that once you come of age and consent, if you are required, say in Singapore, I know it's the case, in Germany, I know it's the case, and perhaps a lot of other European countries, that you sign a declaration that if ever you met with an accident or had a health condition that rendered you brain dead, for example, where the doctors are very clear that there is no hope for survival and recovery, that there is an automatic understanding that your organs can be harvested for purposes of transplant, that you do not need to get consent of the family. You follow? Because I think it's a very terrible thing to talk to a family member whose loved one is in the ICU battling an accident and brain injury, to say, can I take your son's kidney, or can I take his heart, or can I take his liver, or can I take his whatever? You don't do that type of thing. But if you have a legislative process in place and you have proper medical supervision in place that deals with a lot of these issues in terms of signing off to say, the family doctor has signed off to say that unfortunately patient is brain dead and that there is no hope for recovery. And then you have a panel of specialists who also sign off. And that the family doctor's loyalty is always to the family member, you would assume. If you had a family doctor for 40 years, you would know that he would have the family's best interest at heart.
Right.
So he's not going to sign off on something like this without. So this then makes, because then in India, unfortunately, we have a situation, we've got so many road accidents. The highest in the world, I think, is where we have here in India. So it's a horrible thing to say, but the fact of the matter is that you have a factory out there of organs that are available that simply just never get used because we don't have the necessary legislative processes in place.
And that's exactly why we are working for this cause, so that people out there can, early in their life, explain to their family that, like, if they wish to, God forbids, whatever happens in the future, if they wish to donate, their family will always be okay saying yes, no matter how hard the situation be, because the person wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue is that if somebody signs a declaration, then I'm guessing that the family should not even be asked to make that choice. Should not be asked. Now, there is another side to the argument, and it's a sort of a very complicated thing. But I think that one of the things, see, what happens is you have an accident, you get into the hospital. For the first week, you have drained all the family resources in terms of ICU and treatment and everything for most people, and that if the family was to say we give consent to this, that I think that morally and every other which way that the family needs, because if somebody is going to be buying a kidney or something else of the open market and is spending 10 lakhs and 15 lakhs for open heart surgery or some other process, that if the hospital can, by harvesting multiple organs, mitigate the cost of the family that the family has incurred and sometimes very often taken financing and loans from people to pay for the ICU treatment, that, hospitals and the recipients of this should get involved in helping with those costs, I think.
True, sir, but we do have a THOA law which protects, like they have regulations. It's an act which they try to protect buying and selling of organs. So
I understand that it shouldn't be the marketplace, but it's never a simple decision and a simple choice of black and white. I think that, and these are, I'm sure that better minds than mine have got involved in this type of discussion. And I think that what we do here very often is that we take the most extreme worst case and then we make that the benchmark for not doing things.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. And there are other models that work very well. Now, can people abuse the system and this thing? Of course, but people with money will always abuse the system. No matter what safeguards you put in place, I can assure you that people will always, that you can't have safeguards for that type of individual who can buy out the system. But I think that what you need to do is to look at the larger picture of how many more people get served in this process to be as widely inclusive as possible and taking all the necessary safeguards. Then if people break the rules, then you have to have another set of regulations that deal with people who break the rules. But that has to be a separate process.
I agree.
At least, yeah. It's like driving through a red light, 80% of the people will stop. 20% will break the red lights, and so you don't say let's get rid of the red lights because people are breaking the red lights. You catch them and you find the people who are breaking the red lights. Today you fine them 500 rupees, tomorrow you fine them 5,000 rupees, they'll stop. But anyway, that's, yeah.
So, sir,
no, my fault entirely. I'm sorry. I think that I talk too much.
No, that's all right. The more we have to share, the better for people to hear. But coming to the point, I wanted to say that, people these days are apprehensive about donating mostly in cadaver, because a lot of times people don't know who their organs are going to go to, right? So they're very apprehensive about donating their organs there are various reasons ki kisko ja raha hai, whether the organs are, there are religious factors. There are a lot of different factors. People in India are not all are very open to it, let's say. So do you have any comments on that? How that can be changed?
I mean,
They're already
it's the only way. The only way you can do it is talk to people. And like I said, I think that you have to ask these people, if the situation was reversed where they needed an organ, would they be worried about what other people's religious sentiments are and how they would feel about having reservations about giving it for religious reasons and things like that. And there's a great film, I'm sure you've seen it. It is called The Ship of Theseus. Have you seen the film? It's an Indian film.
No,
you should see it.
I will.
Just remember the name of the film. It's called The Ship of Theseus.
Okay.
And it is about somebody who dies and whose organs are available for transplant. And so the eyes go to someone, and the kidney goes to someone, and the heart goes to someone, and the liver goes to someone, and whatever it is. And the experiences of those people who receive the organs, the various sort of, with one person who had religious sentiment about thinking that if he had renal failure, it was God's will that he had renal failure, that he should not be taking anybody else's organ and things like that. And then he resisted it till the very end, and then he suddenly decides that he should take it. That they all then are brought together at the end of the film. These 5 recipients who receive various organs to share their experience with a family member whose loved one had died and whose organs went to these people. It's a wonderful film, and it talks to a lot of these issues. 5 different people, 5 different people who come from 5 different kinds of backgrounds, including religious backgrounds and social backgrounds and things like that, with all of their individual fears and concerns and things like that. And so it's an interesting viewpoint, and I think it's a great thing for people to see. So when you have the time, you should try and get your hands on it.
Definitely, sir. So while concluding this, I want to thank you for sharing your story and being so, sharing such details. So thank you very much.
You are welcome. And I'm, thank you, and thank Aman. And all the best with your initiative. I hope it does well. Okay?
Yes. Thank you, sir.